Hey there, I'm Bijan from PM Exercises, and I'm here today with Sandeep, one of the users of product management exercises. Sandeep has used our website to prepare for his PM interview at Microsoft, and he recently landed a job as a principal PM at Microsoft starting soon in November 2020. Before we start a mock interview together, I'm going to give a chance to Sandeep to introduce himself, tell us a little bit about himself, and then we'll get started. Sandeep, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you giving me a time to give back to the community. Introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're up to next before we get started.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Persian. It's indeed a privilege to be able to give back to the community. Product management exercise indeed helped me a lot preparing for my interview. So a little bit about myself. I've been into product management for good 15, 16 years now, primarily within B2B SaaS space. I'll be joining Microsoft as a principal PM within their office division in November next month. So we're excited to be here and very glad to be able to give back. Thank you.
Great to hear. And can you tell us a little bit about how you went to prepare for your interview as well? I think the community is going to find a lot of value in it.
Absolutely. So my very first step in my preparation was to talk to people I already knew at Microsoft, especially the ones who had recently landed a job within PM. And that gave me enough insights as to how their interview process went, what to expect, what kind of questions to expect, and then lay sort of the roadmap for my preparation. My preparation basically was centered around reading the book very thoroughly, cracking the PM interview. I think it's a classic, and it helped me a lot, gave me a framework to how to think about problems and interview questions. And I actually found this book to be a good reference guide, not just an interview preparation book. So something I would like to refer to even going forward as part of my day-to-day job. PM exercises, as I said before, played a very crucial role. After reading the book was great in providing me an overall framework, but PM exercises where I found a lot of very relevant, very realistic exercises. And before any interview rounds, I would actually go to PM exercises and go through some of the exercises just to jog my brain and warm it up before the actual interview. So it was indeed of great help. Some of the mock interviews that PM exercises team has put together on YouTube were of great help as well. So overall, this was my preparation for the PM interview.
Glad to hear. Well, I'm glad to hear that you found it valuable. And I always get very excited when I hear a success story. So congratulations to you. And again, thank you so much for willing to give some time to do this mock interview. So let's get started. The question that we're going to do today is a technical PM interview question. And the purpose of it is to really showcase how someone can answer a technical question that might be asked during a PM interview at Microsoft or Google and many other companies. The question is, design a system that can detect fraudulent use of Microsoft Word.
All right. So fraudulent use of Microsoft Word. Please give me a couple of minutes to put together my thoughts.
Absolutely. If you like what you're seeing, please like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this one, and visit our website at productmanagementexercises.com.
Right. So right off the bat, Vision, a couple of clarifying questions that I would like to ask. So is this geared towards a specific segment? Is it geared more towards business segment or the consumer segment, because Microsoft Word services both?
So I would say, given the mission of the company, what segment do you think is more relevant to our question?
Right. So Microsoft's vision is to enable every organization and individual for better productivity. So I think it applies equally to both segments. Revenue-wise as well, I think it's both segments play a crucial role as to how much revenue comes from each. So I would like to solve for both segments. And I think the potential solution that we might run into will talk to both segments. If not, we can always come back to the problem and refine it.
Got it. Sounds good.
Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. And when you say fraudulent use of Microsoft Word, I would like to clarify the term fraudulent use. Is it using it without paying for it? Or do you have any other definition in mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's what I mean. Basically, people using it without paying for it.
And is it fair to assume that the primary purpose of building a solution for this is to basically plug that revenue leak that might be happening?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay, I'll take a couple of minutes to brainstorm a few things.
Sounds good. Go ahead.
All right. So Vision, so far we have identified that the purpose of defining a solution is to plug the revenue leak. I think when we think about the user personas for whom it's being designed, I think if we have to segment it into two parts. For business users, is it fair to assume that the persona we're trying to solve for is obviously people on Microsoft side? So let's say people who are responsible for plugging revenue leakages. That is one persona. Also, another persona would be on the businesses side themselves, because let's say if there are people within the company who on designated company hardware are using unofficial versions or hacked version or cracked versions of Microsoft, they would want to know about it, and they would want to plug it, nip it in the bud, so to speak, and before things escalate and they are found guilty as a company of violating the best practices, right? So that is another one. On consumer side, again, it's going to be primarily people on Microsoft side, responsible for plugging revenue leakages, as well as some individual users themselves, because in many cases, depending on how you procure, let's say the hardware you're using, it may come pre-installed with a version of Microsoft Word without you even knowing that the copy of Word that you're using is not actually an authentic copy. It's not a valid copy. It hasn't been paid for, right?
Yeah.
Also, there could be other potential personas around, coming to think of it, hardware vendors who sell off preloaded hardware that already has Microsoft Word, other Microsoft productivity, like Microsoft Office 365, the entire suite, everything preloaded, and then selling it off to businesses and consumers. They would be very interested in knowing if they have the right copy of Word, if it's authentic or not, if it's paid for or not. So these are some of the personas. Is there any specific persona you'd want me to prioritize?
Which one do you think you should prioritize? I think you can make that decision, but I like how you kind of broke it down to different user segments, and you identified specific user groups based on their habits and their behaviors and the journey that they go through. But feel free to pick the one that you think is more relevant.
Sure. So I think in this specific case, I would want to go with the actual consumer. This consumer could be a business user. This consumer could be a B2C consumer using it for their day-to-day work. How do they stay on top of whether the copy of Word that they're using is relevant enough, is a valid copy, it's a paid for copy or not? And the reason I would like to focus on this persona is because it's such a large chunk of users, right? It's probably by far the biggest persona out of all the ones that I've listed.
Yeah.
And many times, and I also speak from personal experience, because I received a desktop for my kid, and it actually came with a pirated copy of Microsoft Word. And I didn't even know about it. And when I did, I actually had to rebuy it and everything, but it was a very painful experience. So this is something I would like to focus on.
Got it. Okay. Makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So as a next step, Vision, I would like to focus on some key problems this persona would be facing, and then work on prioritizing that. So I'll just take a minute to jot it down.
Sure. Sounds good.
Right. So if you think about the consumers, the actual end users who could be benefited by it, the key problems that they typically face would be in one of the following buckets. If you think about their overall journey with Microsoft Word, right? So typically they're either handed over a desktop or laptop by their employer, or they buy it themselves. And many times, as I highlighted earlier, they're in the dark as to whether the software that they have, in this case, Microsoft Word, is a legitimate paid for software, right? So ability to know whether the copy that you're using is a legitimate copy, is a paid for copy, is problem number one. And then the very next step, once they know it's a pirated copy, what to do about it is another problem that they face. Like many times they know it's a pirated copy, but they have no way to figure out the next steps. Can I pay for it? How do I pay for it? Where can I pay for it? Am I in trouble because I've been using pirated copy for so long? Should I report it to my employer if it's in context of a company employee, a B2B user? Then related to that is ability to report it, especially if you are a B2B end user, to the higher authorities, to the IT department, so they can do something about it. And the last is ability to pay for it and convert it into a legal paid for software. So these are the key problems that I would like to solve for. Is there any specific one that you would like me to go into more depth into?
So you mentioned that if the issue comes in and you realize that this is, let's say this is not the authorized version of it. Does that include me, let's say, buying a laptop from somebody at a store and then realizing that it's not the right one? Or is it more about me getting it from my employer? Which one? Or both?
It's both, actually. So given that we are solving for both segments, it's for both. But if you were to prioritize one over the other, because I think the solution may differ depending on which segment we kind of delve into. I think volume-wise and even potential revenue-wise, the B2C segment is much larger. There could be other aspects to it, such as recovery of revenue, which might be easier in case of B2B segment.
Yeah.
But just looking at it from plain revenue leakage perspective, the B2C segment is something I would like to prioritize. And I think based on that, if you were to look at the problems we highlighted, we can prioritize those problems as well, right? Because they're kind of disparate problems. We think about B2B versus B2C. Now, in this case, ability to know whether I'm using a pirated copy, an unauthorized version of, would be number one, because that's the genesis of everything. Then knowing what to do next is going to be number two. And I would skip reporting part for B2C consumer because that may not apply that much.
Okay.
But ability to pay for it and do something about it to turn it into a legitimate copy would be number three. So the sequence will be ability to know it's a pirated copy, then know what to do about it, all the possibilities that I have at my behest, and then doing something about it, which is paying for it in this case.
Got it. Okay, sounds good.
All right. So I think next I would like to jump into the solutioning part, which is if you were to pick, let's say, one of the problems, I would like to go for ability to know that I'm using a pirated copy and delve right into it. We can cover others, but I think with the time limitation, that's the one I would like to pick, especially because it's the genesis of everything. I mean, all the other two kind of build up on it. Is that okay with you, or?
Yeah, I like it. I think it makes sense to really pick one of the basically key parts of the journey and really dig into how you can solve for it. So let's get into how would you know that the copy that you're using is basically a pirated version?
Sure. Great. So I'll take just 30 seconds to jot down my thoughts here. Right. So I think if we were to zoom into that specific problem, ability to know that I'm using a pirated copy, we have to think about the user journey, especially for a B2C consumer user who can get to a pirated copy in one of the following three ways. One is they buy a new piece of hardware and the Microsoft Word comes pre-installed on it.
Mm-hmm.
Second is they buy the software itself, let's say from supermarket, a DVD or a CD, or some hard disk that already has the software in it, and use it for installation. And the third one is they download it. They go to some site, which may or may not be the official Microsoft site, and they download the software, then they install it on their system. So if you were to solve for each one of them, I think in case of buying a new hardware, the hardware itself, I mean, installed Microsoft Word should have enough checks to basically give a prompt to the user that they're using a pirated copy, and then they can show them options to pay for it, or to just share it with Microsoft, because if you're a consumer, that's the best thing you can do. So they can trace the source and they can recover their revenue. So you're not you're not a culprit. If you are buying a CD or installation, I think I would like to solve for it in a proactive way. So rather than letting user install everything, waste their time on it, and then getting to know that there's something wrong with the copy that they've received, I would like to solve for it upfront, where there is enough checks and bounds in place. Let's say if you bought a CD that has already been installed or something, the CD packaging has a code on it that you can put in on, let's say, Microsoft website, and it gives you a very broad, a very detailed description of whether it's the right copy you're using, whether it's already been installed, whether this copy has already exceeded the number of licenses that it was supposed to be servicing. So even before you go into the whole installation process and everything, proactively you get to know. And within downloading, I think same applies. Although in case of downloading, because it depends on which site you're downloading it from, it may not be a legitimate site to begin with. So it may not be the right thing to expect them to have these checks and bounds in place. Then the use case will be exactly the same as buying a new piece of hardware, right? You have to install it, and then Microsoft Word is smart enough to tell the user that, hey, the registration key that you're using, you're not authorized to use it on this specific hardware, and you should report it to Microsoft and or pay for it and turn it into a legitimate copy.
Okay. All right. So from these different basically use cases that you identified, or different scenarios that you identified, which ones would you like to focus on?
Right. So I think I'd like to focus on the first one, which is buying a new piece of hardware, a laptop or desktop, because typically that's how you get pre-installed software in the first place.
Yeah.
I think CD-based installation is kind of becoming fast obsolete, with the majority of hardware not even supporting CD-ROMs and everything. Yeah. Downloading would be I think it would be a big candidate as well. But I think if we solve for buying a new hardware, it would solve for the downloading part as well, as I earlier pointed out, right? Because
Yeah.
you already have Microsoft Word installed on your hardware, and Word itself is telling you. So I would like to pick the first one, which is you buying a new piece of hardware, and then Microsoft Word telling you it's not a legitimate paid for copy.
Got it. Okay. All right. Let's do it.
All right. So I think within that, would you want me to jump into how it's going to feel and behave like, or would you want to go into the technical architecture side of it?
I'm more interested in the technical architecture side. So it will be great if you can kind of describe the high level experience that you think is going to exist and quickly jump into the technical side and describing how basically the mechanics of it is going to work and how the system is going to be designed. Yeah.
Okay, Bridget. So I'll just take 30, 40 seconds to jot on my thoughts.
Sounds good.
All right. So this is where my head is, Vision. In terms of solving for it, as I alluded to earlier as well, when you buy a new piece of hardware, Microsoft Word should have enough checks built into itself that it prompts the user upon very first uses, so that the user is always in the green if they bought it unknowingly, because that's the problem we're solving for. And for that to happen, there has to be some validation process, and we cannot really expect every client machine, which is a user's laptop or a desktop in this case, to have this validation. So Microsoft Word will have to enforce registration when the user logs in for the first time before they can ever use it, and it will enforce connecting to the web for that, because that's where the whole validation resides. And as part of the overall experience, before we get into the technicalities of it, the user logs into Microsoft Word prompts them to register. Then it connects to a validation service in the background, which has access to which keys are supposed to be used on which pieces of hardware signatures. And if it doesn't match, then it returns a response which tells the user, hey, you're using an unauthenticated, unpaid for copy of Microsoft Word. And then it gives them further options as to what to do with it. So that's something I have in mind in terms of the overall behavior of it. Can I provide you any more clarification on the behavior side before we move on to the services and how they're going to interplay?
I'm good. So one question that I have is I'm trying to get a sense of how you think the registration or basically logging into Microsoft Word is different than the experience of basically logging into your computer. Are these two connected to each other, or are they separate? Do you see them, they need to be somehow interrelated? Or do we think them of separate use cases? What are the issues with connecting, not connecting? It'd be great if you can kind of talk a little bit about the concept of identity on Microsoft Word versus the concept of identity at basically Windows or like the machine on its own, and whether or not the two need to be related to each other somehow.
So I think, again, if you're talking about end users, we have to think about the segments they could fall into. So I think it will be slightly wrong to assume that all of them are on Windows, because Microsoft Word is built for both Windows and Mac.
Okay.
And there's a substantial chunk of users who are on Mac as well. So I think connecting the Windows identity to Word identity may not always work. But for those cases where it does work, we should make use of it, because it kind of simplifies the whole login process, creation of account process. They don't have to create two accounts. But for, let's say, Mac users who are on Mac OS, this may not work. So it'll have to be a separate registration for MS Word users, who basically, as part of the registration process, they create their details. And I'm talking about Mac OS first. They create their own details and the details of their hardware, and the copy of um, Microsoft Word that they're using on their Mac gets sent to this validation service. Um, in case of Windows, where they have this option of connecting their Windows identity with the MS Word identity, kind of merging the two. They do not have to recreate their settings, but the other part where they're sending the hardware details and the MS Word license key and authentication details over to this validation service, that part remains the same.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks for clarification.
Great. Cool. So allow me a couple of moments to just jot down my thoughts on how the services will look like.
And please stay around and watch till the end of the video, where Sandeep will share with us his tips on how to do well in a PM interview and how to prep for it.
So I wish we had a whiteboard, but so I think if you, I hope you can see it.
Yeah.
It's on my iPad, right? So this is how the rough sort of block diagram will look like for this. On the left, you have these client laptops or desktops that were trying to access Microsoft Word. In the center, you have this validator service, which in turn has access to a database that stores the keys, authenticated keys for MS Office, as well as a payment gateway mechanism. So in the first part, when somebody from their hardware is trying to access Microsoft Word, after the registration process is complete, they send their details, their hardware details, as well as Microsoft Word licensing details over to this validation service, which in turn reaches out to this key database and authenticates or validates rather whether this particular hardware is allowed to use this instance of Microsoft Word, and then it returns a response back to the client desktops or laptops, telling them, hey, you're not allowed to use it, and also gives them options as to what to do about it. And should they choose to, let's say, pay for it and turn it into a valid copy of Microsoft Word, then the validator service facilitates the payment gateway process as well. And then after this is complete, it returns a valid license key, which gets embedded and becomes part of their MS Office installation. So they are now using a valid and authenticated copy of Microsoft Word.
Got it.
I hope it was legible, it was coming through.
Yeah, no, I think this is pretty good. Now I'm curious to know, how will it work in case of, let's say, somebody changing their computer. So they already have, let's say, access to Word in one computer, and they have another computer, or they recently decided that they wanted to switch. How would that work with this current system that you've designed?
So the way I see it, visual, it depends on the licensing part itself. Ideally, just to make it very user friendly, the licensing itself should allow for users of at least 2 to 3 devices, because in modern world, everybody is using multiple devices, and to make the pricing very friendly and the user experience very friendly, people should be allowed to use the same copy on multiple devices. Maybe there's a special license for it. But assuming that is not the case, assuming each copy of Microsoft Word is bound to an instance, a hardware instance, I think the whole registration part that we talked about in the beginning will apply to switching machines as well, right? So when, let's say, you're porting over everything over to a new piece of hardware, a new laptop you bought, then again, there's 2 parts to it, right? One is the new piece of hardware, does it have Microsoft Word pre-installed? If yes, then when you authenticate at the time of first login, you would use your pre-created Microsoft Word account. And then it would prompt you, hey, you already have an authenticated key that you could use on this one, but you'll have to forego off your old laptop in case you're indeed switching to a new laptop that is just fine with you. right? So that'll make the whole process seamless. Um, and then I think there'll need to be additional check in place where, let's say, once you have moved over to the new laptop, in case you log back in from the old one, the validator service that we spoke about earlier will take care that the old hardware is not bound to this key anymore. It's not a valid use of this key anymore.
Got it. That makes sense. Now I'm curious to know, I'm going to think about one more edge case. So let's say that the way it works is, one license has, let's say, 3 devices, the way you described it. I think it totally makes sense. Sometimes people have, their phones or their laptop. They have a work laptop, they have a home laptop, or maybe they have one in their, I don't know, like their hallway, in their hall room, and then they have one in their room. There's some like people have like, these edge cases. So what could happen is, we go with the model of 1 license per 3 devices. One potential scenario would be that, somebody's access is used by another individual fraudulently, so that they don't have to pay. Let's say for whatever reason, they gained access to your credentials and they were able to they would try to add their own device to your list of authorized devices. I'm curious to know how you think the validator system that you've designed is going to be able to detect that or prevent that or reduce the likelihood of that from happening.
So thinking through this, Visual, I think, so let's say if you're allowed to use single key on, let's say, 3 devices max, 1 to 3 devices. And let's say you already using it on your personal laptop, you're just making use of 1 such installation out of the 3 that you're allowed to do. And somebody else out there just installed it. They kind of hacked your key somehow. So I think there's no foolproof way of knowing, at least to this validator service, that it's not you who has just installed this second installation. But at the very least, it should send you a notification saying, hey, your key was just used on this device in this certain location. Was it you? And if the answer is no, hey, it wasn't me, then the validator service should block access to that second machine. So it should have that concept of a primary installation, the first installation that's authenticated, that's validated, and then any new add-ons on top, a notification gets sent to the user, and then the user can approve or disapprove this new installation. And I think that should take care of this scenario that you just spoke about.
Got it. Now, I think the hardest edge case, to your point, is a scenario where maybe the owner of the private key is actually sharing that key with somebody else. I'm going to throw this as like a kind of a bonus question and say, can you think about a way to basically prevent that scenario where I pass, let's say, my information to somebody else, a different identity, and they use my identity to activate their own basically laptop with my Microsoft Word license?
Right. Okay. So I think if I understood your question correctly, Bijal, you're asking if you as a user are in the wrong and you're not playing by the rules, you're sharing your key with, let's say, multiple people.
Yeah.
Right. And is it safe to assume that the key itself is bound to a single machine, or it can be used on multiple machines?
It can be used by multiple machines. So, let's say we've set up the 3 machine rule that you discussed earlier, or 3 device rule. Right. But the additional machines are not owned by myself. They're basically owned by others.
Right. So I think in this case, the only potential way that I can think of is, hey, let's say you're sharing it with your wife and your kids. I think those use cases should be allowed,
okay,
because those are valid. But in cases where I think the real fraud, because that was the whole genesis of this line of questioning, was how do we and nip the fraudulent activity in the bud would be somebody using their set of three allowed installations on a rotationary basis, right? They're allowing some of their friends to use it, some of the coworkers to use it, and then it passes on. At one given time, they're always using the set of three installations, but it's being rotated around, right? So I think in one of the potential solutions to problem like that would be this validator service kind of keeps track of how many machines are switching or kind of sharing these keys, and if the frequency of users is in close proximity, right? It's happening on an hourly basis, or and then the key change happens, let's say, every few hours or every few days. That's a clear indication that these keys are being rotated around in an illegal manner. And again, I think in this case, since the user himself is allowing it, there should be a way to caution the user around this potential fraudulent way of using it, because the user may not even be aware that it's a bad activity. So validator service, again, through the notification mechanism, can send a mechanism saying, hey, it looks like you're sharing it with a broad set of people. It's not allowed as per our policy, so please curb it, stop doing it. And if that doesn't happen, there should be enough mechanism in place to basically block that key, the entire set of primary key on the primary installation and the other installations of it, so that this fraudulent activity kind of stops.
Got it. Thanks for that. I want to go back quickly to the validator that you've mentioned. So it looks like you have a validator that basically talks to another system that's keeping track of the machines, or the basically machine addresses that are licensed to or are permitted to use that. Can you discuss a little bit how these two systems work with each other, and when does the validator send a signal? Like, what are the use cases? Like, when do these two systems talk to each other a little bit?
So in the backend, the validator is connected to two separate systems. One is a key database that basically maps keys to hardware installations, because each piece of hardware has a signature, and that's where the mapping is maintained. The second is a payment gateway system, which facilitates turning invalid keys into valid keys, processing the payments and everything. So in case of the first one, which again I'm trying to show here, is it coming through okay?
Yeah.
Right. So the key DB system that the validator is talking to, this will be accessed very, very frequently, relatively speaking. I mean, payment gateway will be an infrequent user, but just to validate every single login or every single users of Microsoft Word on a specific hardware, the validator service will be talking to this key database management service. And this in turn is where sort of the magic happens, which tells you, hey, this specific hardware is not allowed to be using this key or allowed to be using this key. And even to our last point, this key has been rotated around a bit too much. So it seems like the potential fraudulent activity flag should go up. And that's where this kind of interaction is happening. This on payment gateway side is a very infrequent transaction between the validator service and the payment gateway service. It only happens when they indeed know, hey, we're using a wrong copy and an unauthenticated copy, and they want to pay for it. And that's when the payment and everything passes through. And in return, the payment gateway kind of gives a green signal to the validator. And I think there should be one arrow going from payment gateway into the key database management service as well, because that's where the payment gateway is telling the key database, hey, this key is in the green, it's being paid for, it wasn't before, so update your databases so that you can now give it a go ahead.
Got it. And are you thinking that this communication between the validator and the database that maps the system that maps the keys to the machines, does that happen on every client interaction? or like every time they log into Microsoft Word or they open Microsoft Word, or it's only the first time that they log into Microsoft Word? Like what would be the kind of the frequency that makes sense to you? Or like something else,
Yeah,
maybe there's a different set of frequency that you should be thinking about.
right. So I think the interaction between the validator service and the key database service, it does not need to happen at every single login, because it may not even be possible at every single login, to be honest.
Yeah.
So there needs to be some sort of caching in place, especially in cases where the user is kind of logging in and they're not connected to the internet. This will not work. But just because they do not have internet, and doesn't mean you should penalize them by saying, "Hey, we couldn't authenticate you, can't use it." So you have to allow for those kind of edge cases. But beyond that, I think it has to be frequent enough where all of the anomalies that we spoke about, the keys being rotated, keys being used on more devices than the stipulated number of devices, for those to happen, it should be at least done, let's say, once a week or so. And I think that would be the right balance between revenue leakage, and you would obviously want to stop it as quickly as possible, versus providing the right user experience and allow for the edge cases that the user might experience. For example, no connection to the internet.
Got it. Sounds good. Yeah, that makes sense. Anything else you wanted to add, or yeah?
No, I think that sums up the solution pretty well. If there's anything you would want me to delve deeper into, I'll be glad to.
Sounds good. No, I think it was great. Well, before I start giving you feedback, how do you think you did? I'm curious to know what your thoughts were.
I think I did all right. And I think there was the whole process of where we were thinking about segments and the problems they faced. I think I could have been clearer in terms of which segment we want to delve into upfront, rather than jumping back and forth. Even when we were going to solutioning part, there was some confusion there. So apart from that bit, I think it went pretty okay.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think I really liked your answer, to be honest. Like, I thought it was a really well thought out answer. I like the clarification questions that you asked at the beginning. You mentioned that the reason you're picking more than one user group is because you think the two of them are very similar in this particular use case that you were dealing with them. And later, when you realize that there's, the use cases kind of are a little bit different, you were confident enough to say that, hey, I'm just going to focus on this one use case. And the reason for it is because it's larger than the other ones. And we think if we can address that, that's going to contribute significantly to prevention of revenue leakage. I liked how you described the user journeys to talk about how they impact basically these scenarios. You talked about a system that's going to prevent the abuse of the system. I think, to be honest, the only two feedback that I would have is one is, like you said, I think you could have probably spent a little bit less time describing the user groups, but I think it was good. But probably you could have used spend a little bit less time. I think for people that are kind of limited by time, it's good to try to kind of go through that section faster if possible, just so that you can spend more time on the design part and the solutioning part. And I think the part that I would have ideally liked to hear from you is also talking a little bit about the trade-offs. But you were pretty open to addressing them, and I asked and I questioned you about the edge cases. I think that's fine as well. Overall, I really liked the question. I really liked the answer you gave. So thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking time to give back to the community. And at the end, I'd love to ask if you have any suggestions and ideas for people on how to prepare for their interviews. I think people will find a lot of value in knowing your opinion on what the best practices are. You've been a success story, and I would love to hear your opinion on how to go about preparing for their interviews.
Absolutely. So Visual, first and foremost, thank you so much for this opportunity. Really glad to be able to give back to the community. And so one thing that worked out well for me was I was constantly probing the interview for feedback as to was I going into too much detail, too little, how much was too much, and that helped. So it kept it conversational, and at every sort of checkpoint, I was constantly talking back and kind of gleaning that feedback from the interview. I think in terms of a tip that I would like to share, and this applies to Microsoft and other tech companies as well, is it's a good idea to talk to people who have already been interviewed to learn about their experience, but take it with a pinch of salt, because in my case, my experience was actually a lot different. The kind of questions were different. The flavor was different. They were more technical in nature than compared to the people I had spoken to. So the way I would put it is learn from their experience, but still keep your preparation broad enough and be ready for unexpected situations on the call. But yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Again, thank you for joining today's session. For those of you that watched this video, if you like what you saw, please give us a thumbs up. Like this video so we can share it with others. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website at productmanagementexercises.com, where you can get access to over 1,000 interview questions, a prep course that helps you prep for your interview, a community of over 20,000 and members that are preparing for their interviews. And all this, I think, really helps you do well in your prep interview. Thank you so much again, Sandeep. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thanks for you. Bye.